I am going to be somewhat informal today and tell you the story of my book and where it came from and why I wrote it. I'll start with that. And then I'll tell you a few of the primary results of the research and a few of the arguments that I have, after first telling a few of the methodological issues that I came across in researching this. So how did I come to the topic? Well, it all began many years ago when I made my first trip to the Soviet Union. So anyway, this is 1987 when I had a little bit more hair, and I was making my first trip to the then Soviet Union, and of course when I was an undergraduate, the Berlin Wall fell, and I had a bunch of German friends actually, and we would meet every Friday for breakfast. And I came late one morning, and I had picked up on the way the current issue of Current History. It's a journal that was sold at the newsstands. And the title article, the lead article, was East Germany in 2039, question mark. And the argument in the article was resounding yes. Well, I met my German friends, and they had a crate of champagne. I hadn't heard the news that the wall had fallen. So these were the formative experiences of my undergraduate years, and one of the things that I did when I was a senior is organize a group of students to go over to Estonia, and we were at the Song Festival in Tallinn, Estonia in 1990, when in the grand finale performance there were an estimated 1 million Estonians in attendance, and at the time in Estonia there were 900,000 ethnic Estonians. This was literally the entire nation in one place singing its way to freedom. And so these things really had a big impact on me and I think on my generation. And many of us at the time were entering the fields that was dominated by other concerns of the cultural turn, popular politics, and many of us saw the power of nationalism firsthand and felt it, and it was a really life-changing and I think career-orienting event for many of us, and me included. One of the things that I became really interested in is the role of Russian nationalism and concepts of the Russian nation within both the Soviet Union at that time, but then historically as well. What role did that dynamic play in the late imperial era? And I thought that was something that was underexplored, the potential power of a Russian nation within the larger. And that led me to the topic of my first book, which is called Nationalizing the Russian Empire, the Campaign Against Enemy Aliens During World War I. It's a study of, I guess, a kind of dynamic energization of the Russian nation in order to fight the external enemy during World War I. And what happened when that occurred was also a large number of tensions within the Russian Empire that I think was a very important dynamic in the years leading up to the 1917 revolution, the collapse, the mobilization for war, and etc. That book was very deeply grounded in archival work that I did in the State Archive of the Russian Federation in Moscow, and in the military archive as well. The swimming in the sources was really crucial to that project, and it led directly to my next project on Russian citizenship. Because when I was writing the story of the mobilization against enemy aliens, I looked for the book on Russian citizenship that should have existed to find just basic backgrounds, the background story of the history of Russian citizenship, how nationality was acquired, how it was lost, all of those kind of things. And I could not find it, it wasn't there. So as I was researching the topic for the first book, I already began to take notes for my second book and had a separate set of files for that and planned that as my next book. The question that arose during the First World War was very much to do with citizenship, because the enemy aliens are subjects or citizens of states with which Russia was at war. And so that led in particular to this study of Russian citizenship. That's the academic story and sort of the train of events that led to this book in one sense. Another was, of course, contemporary issues and politics. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly you had 15 new states with international borders. And of course, the map looks very neat. You have Kazakhs are orange and Turkmen, etc. But then, if you look at the ethnic map, there's not a very close correspondence between where ethnic groups live and where these neat borders are, and that led to, as we know, many problems. The Armenia-Azeri border wars, the Chechen War, the citizenship wars in the Caucasus, all kinds of different issues with the Georgian War in 2008, which I was lucky enough to be present for, taking a family vacation in Georgia right before the war broke out. But citizenship, of course, has been a huge issue, and in the last few weeks as well with Crimea. So there was the contemporary issues of citizenship, which were hugely important and very much central. That also led me to the interest in citizenship, and that of course spurred a renewed academic interest in citizenship with Rogers Brubaker's path-breaking sort of sociological look at different ideal types of citizenship embodied in the French and German cases, and then a whole string of criticism of Rogers Brubaker that came afterwards, and further development of ideas of citizenship and the like. So there were many things that led me to this book. Let me say a few words about the basic approaches that I took in studying it. The fundamental approach that I took was to try to figure out what you might call the fundamental aspects were of the Russian citizenship tradition. In what way was the Russian practices and approaches and theoretical musings about citizenship, in what ways were they similar to other countries, and in what ways were they different? The approach that I took is to focus on what I call the citizenship boundary. That's the boundary between those who are citizens and those who are not. To look at the ways in which this boundary was crossed, the ways in which the boundary was conceptualized, defended, ignored, practiced. The focus is much more on practices of the state and the implementation of policies than it is on the theories, although I do look at theories as well. So that's the basic approach. There are a few methodological issues that I think. Well, let me tell you what the basic chapters or the basic subdivisions of the book are. One is an initial chapter on the deep history of the Russian approaches to all of these questions of the citizenship boundary or the subjective boundary. The second is a look at annexation policy. How were new regions that were annexed by the Russian state, how were those citizens or subjects, those new subjects, how were they brought into formal subjecthood or citizenship? There's a large chapter on immigration, movement into the empire, which also includes analysis of naturalization policies, how individuals became formal members of the state. There's a big chapter on emigration policy and denaturalization policy, and then there's also a look at World War I, the early Soviet era up until Stalin, and then a conclusion and epilogue that takes the story very quickly up to the present day or close to the present day. So that's the basic approach. A couple more of the issues that were, I think, methodologically challenging. And the biggest one is sources. Citizenship is very hard to research because sources that appear in the archives, almost by definition, are exceptions or appeals for exceptions from the normal rules. And citizenship policy in every state continues through all of the history of citizenship, but even especially today in some sense. There are many paths to citizenship or to the loss of citizenship, and exceptions are more the rule than the norm. So if you're trying to write a normative history, if you're trying to find the norm, how do you do that when all of your sources are simply exceptions? Well, it's very difficult, and I think it really requires sitting in those archives that I showed you a minute ago for a long time and just trying to intuitively get a sense for the way bureaucrats acted, the kinds of decisions governors made, the thought processes that went behind their decision making. That's about all one can do, is to try to get at what the normal practices are. And occasionally I found a golden moment when there was a particular insight that was really valuable. But my favorite one was with immigration policy. There was a move to basically legalize immigration, or at least to reform it to make it much easier. There's a long tradition that I'll talk about in a moment of making immigration very difficult from the Russian Empire. At the turn of the 20th century, there was an attempt to legalize. And in order to do that, the Ministry of Trade issued a memo that it sent to all the other departments, the Ministry of Interior, the Border Police, all kinds of different groups, and said, what are your practices on immigration? What actually happens? And everyone wrote their responses back and compiled a big 200-page report. And the report begins with the sentence, as we all know, 80 to 90% of all immigrants from the Russian Empire leave without permission, documents, or knowledge of the state. And I was like, whoa, really? We didn't all know that. And then it explains in great detail what actually happens. And what actually happened was there were immigrant smuggling groups, and there was a graduated system of payment for getting smuggled across the border. There was even a lux kind of service that was a sort of high-class service available for an extra fee. And it was really quite eye-opening to see that the practices diverged so incredibly from the actual written laws on immigration. And it was through this internal source. So there were occasional moments like that allowed me to at least get a sense for what the actual practices were and get around the basic problem of sources. The other methodological approach that I tried to use, and I, in some instances succeeded, and in some instances maybe not so much, is to break away from the nation-state paradigm and try to write the history of citizenship as an entangled history, as a history that is not contained within national boundaries. Citizenship is a particularly good topic for this approach, because as some legal theorists have argued, by its very definition, citizenship is a subject of international law rather than domestic law. One state's claims to a citizen as their own, at least in the 19th century, was a pretty mutually exclusive claim, because there was a very, very strict prohibition on dual citizenship. That's broken down in the 20th century, of course. But still, it's clearly an international institution, and it's interactive. And the boundary between citizenries is something that is defined internationally through international interaction and, if not laws, then actions which have repercussions. So there are a couple examples maybe to make this concrete. One of them that I found to be really interesting was the event in German history, really, in 1885 when Bismarck and the Prussian state police expelled all Russian subjects on German soil in one season. It was about 25,000 temporary workers. They were all expelled back to Russia. And this caused a huge interaction. I mean, Germany and Russia had gotten along quite well before that. This was a really big event in the diplomatic history of those two countries. And the crisis went on for about 5 years. And in the end, in 1890, what came out of it was the modern Gastarbeiter system of modern Germany. And it was a system which basically made it possible for Russian subject temporary workers to come into Germany and work, but they had to leave at the end of the season. And there were all kinds of new prohibitions and restrictions and barriers to them staying or naturalizing as German citizens. This was a huge event in the history of that border region between Germany and Russia. And the end result of it was that actually many more Russian temporary workers came, but only as seasonal workers. So what happened in the Russian Empire? Well, That event, which had domestic German origins, then led to a series of measures in the western borderland against foreign subjects who were on Russian soil for various reasons. But more importantly, administrators from the western region took those ideas and that system that Germany had created and plopped it down in the Far East and used it to regulate Korean and Japanese and Chinese laborers coming across the border to work temporarily in the Russian Far East. So this is one example. There are many other examples as well where the origins of a Russian practice, domestic practice, actually take, if one follows the logical chain where the origins came from, you might leave the country for a while. And so in that chapter, I actually have about a 10-page sort of section on Germany and the German origins of the Gastarbeiter system. So anyway, I've tried to evangelize. I know that it's a popular approach here in Germany in particular, the idea of entangled histories and breaking down national borders or the borders between empires and how they interact. And so I agree, and I've tried to do it myself. So that's a little bit about the methods and the background of the book. Let me very quickly tell you a few things about the basic findings of the book. So one finding is that there's a very deep tradition of what I call attract and hold in Russian subjected citizenship policy. And it goes back many centuries and it's remarkably persistent. This policy is based on, in the early periods of Russian history, it's based on the idea that population is good, it's the source of wealth and prosperity, it's the source of national power, and that all bodies are good for a state in some sense. And it was pursued really quite persistently through many different eras of Russian history. I have a section on the 17th century, attempts to draw in foreign mercenaries and investors, you might call them, and then especially in the 18th century under Elizabeth and Catherine, there are invitations to various groups to come and settle the open steppe recently conquered from the Ottoman Empire. And the methods that the czars evolved to attract populations to the Russian Empire involved what I call a sort of separate deals paradigm, where each group that's brought in, and most immigration was not individual, it was mostly by group. Each group was given a charter, they were given a separate legal status and set of deals that could include exemption from taxes for a set amount of years, it could include exemption from military service forever or for a certain period of years. Each contract with each group was quite different. And it's a bewildering array of different types of citizenship regimes or subjected regimes for each of these groups that came in. And in some sense, that approach to subjecthood is antithetical to the modern notion of citizenship as equal rights and obligations under the law. But it was a tremendously effective system for building an empire. It was applied also in the aftermath of annexations to a certain degree, where annexed populations were given their own separate deal. The most famous case being, maybe the most extreme case being the German nobility and burghers in the Baltic states who were allowed to retain total control over their local society and were given many privileges as part of the separate deal that they got. So this attract and hold policy, the separate deals approach, went very much hand in hand, and it was a very deep tradition in Russian history. And it persisted much longer than one might have thought, because at a certain point, by the late 19th century, Russia really had an overpopulation problem. It sounds strange for such a big empire, but the arable land in that empire is very small, and within the areas of good soil, by many measures, Russia had an overpopulation problem, and yet this attract and hold policy was very persistent. Along with it, to go more specifically into the citizenship concepts that are usually discussed, going back to Brubaker and others, the difference between jus soli and jus sanguinis. Jus soli is the territorial principle of citizenship, that everyone on a given territory will be ascribed citizenship at birth. that it was a pretty strong tradition in the Russian case, and it went very much with this approach to population, that everyone on the territory should be naturalized and should become part of the Russian Empire. So the flip side of this approach to population, that population is good and we need to hold population in via subjecthood and citizenship policy, was approaches to emigration and denaturalization. There's a very deep tradition in Russian history treating emigration basically as an illegal act. There was a whole tradition that went way back. It had early periods, an expression in the early periods of keeping the nobles and elites and military servitors through various means within the empire and not allowing them to leave. And it was expressed much later through the late 19th century by the persistence of an extremely negative approach to emigration that really made Russia distinct from most other countries. Most other countries liberalized their emigration laws and practices, making it very, very simple to leave. And this was a very important aspect of the Russian citizenship tradition. The foreign passport in the late 19th century cost the average of the monthly wage of a farm laborer. And in many other countries, it became just a matter of a few almost insignificant fees and very quick to emigrate. So that's another distinctive thing about the Russian system. So another of the big themes in the book is the reforms of citizenship laws in the 1860s. The 1860s were the era of the Great Reforms, the Russian Great Reforms. The big one being the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. But even before that reform, the very first of the Great Reforms, I call it the Forgotten Great Reform. I don't know if anyone ever knew it really existed, so it can't really be forgotten. But it was the reform of immigration and naturalization policies. And it was discussed already in the 1850s. And it was very explicitly meant to be at the core of the strategy of the Great Reforms, which was modernization, and modernization via globalization. And this was an attempt to make immigration and naturalization easier and to reform the entire set of rules and regulations to make the position of foreigners more secure and legally defensible, and it really worked. All of these reforms worked. The number of border crossings multiplied with extreme rapidity. In the 1850s, there were about 40,000 total registered border crossings by foreigners and Russian subjects combined. By the 1860s, about 100,000. By 1900, there were 4 million border crossings and 10 million just in the year of 1910 alone. And the actual number was much higher because most border crossings weren't even legally registered. Most of them were illicit. This is a big theme of the book as well, that the intensivity of border crossings goes up until we hit World War I. The role of citizenship in the minds of the practitioners of the Russian state who applied these policies was still very much this populationist bent to attract and hold and not let them go, basically, with one big, huge caveat. And this is a huge theme in the book as well. And that caveat is the role of, you might say, ethnically or populationally distinct policies for those who were favored members of the national community, those who were not favored. And this was applied most apparently to Jews and Muslims. So the great exception to attract and hold and dissuading immigration was with Jewish policy. It culminated in 1892 with the decision to allow offices of the Jewish Colonization Association to open up throughout the empire, 400 offices. They were in turn empowered to give passports, exit visas, really. They were called foreign passports, but it was really an exit visa. They were allowed to issue them themselves without all of the extremely complicated stamps and approvals and bribes that one would have to go through to do it through legal channels. Basically, they were given a lower price for their, a very, very steeply discounted price for their exit documents, and they could be issued them in expedited fashion. So there was clearly a different approach to Jewish immigration. There were also episodic cases of large-scale Muslim immigration, one being at the conclusion of the conquest of the Caucasus in the aftermath of the Crimean War, when large numbers of Muslims left. Also going back to Catherine the Great, after the conquest of many of the regions, there was another massive immigration of Crimean Tatars and other Muslim groups from the Caucasus. In each of these cases, there was a peculiar practice that was really quite distinct to the Russian Empire of allowing these immigrations, but on the condition of a promise of no return, which was actually stamped in the exit documents of the groups that were leaving. That sent a pretty clear signal as to the idea that some groups, if they did leave, then it would not be allowed to come back. It was an attempt to use subjecthood policy or citizenship policy to pursue a form of population policy that was distinctly oriented at building a different kind of population, allowing some groups to leave while holding on to others. And the reason why immigration policy, I think, or I argue in my book, I think that the reason why it wasn't really freed up and liberated was very clearly discussed in the in the Council of Ministers in the late imperial period, as based on the fear that if things were loosened up, that Slavs would start to emigrate. If you look at immigration statistics, it's a really amazing story. Jews were 184 times more likely to emigrate than Russians, Germans 55 times more likely, and Poles 57 times more likely. Only 2% of all the immigrants in Russian history up until 1914 were Russians. Just very, very tiny numbers. Part of it was because of this distinction in immigration policy. Probably the bigger explanation, though, is the Russian commune and partible inheritance, because most people who ended up in the United States ended up there because they were second and third sons in systems with primogeniture, and they didn't get the farms, so they had to go somewhere else. In Russia, of course, second and third sons still got a plot of land, so there wasn't that push for immigration coming out of the Russian case. But that said, these differential policies towards immigration surely had an impact as well. So another theme in the book is this is a big sort of exception to the general thrust of Russian population policies regarding citizenship of holding, attracting and holding, except for some groups, which, okay, fine. Not only will we accept your departure, but maybe even in some cases encourage it. So then World War I comes along, and that's the story of my first book. So I quickly go through it in this book as it relates specifically to the topics of citizenship and subjecthood that I deal with throughout the book. One of the core arguments in this book is that the link between modernization strategy and subjecthood and citizenship policies that was declared in the 1860s was really broken during World War I, when a massive campaign to liquidate businesses that belonged to enemy subjects was launched. When the borders were closed, there was a ban on naturalization. In many ways, World War I is a real breakpoint, I argue, in the history of Russian subjecthood and citizenship. Then in the Soviet era, I deal in detail with the Soviet era only up until right around 1930, when Stalin really closes the doors and launches forced industrialization, cut off for the most part from the outside world. And in the Soviet era, a lot happened as well, of course. There was a declaration of an open invitation to the workers of the world to come join the Great Soviet experiment. And this is a border post on the border of Estonia. And it says, "Workers of the world unite," on the gate. But you can't really get to the gate because there's lots of barriers. And I think it's a good metaphor for Soviet policy because in principle, this was a global revolution and the proletarians of the world were supposed to unite. In practice, in the Soviet era, workers of the world could not come to the Soviet Union because the OGPU, the secret police of the Soviet Union, controlled very tightly all permissions for any foreigners to come into the country, and they really didn't want foreigners coming in for a couple of reasons. One, in the early 20s, there were unemployment issues, and having more workers come in was not good. Two, those workers, the first delegations of workers who did come, actually went back to their home communities, many of them disillusioned, and spread lots of bad news and bad press about economic conditions in the Soviet Union. So for those reasons, but then the third reason is probably even more important. Because the NKVD at first and then the OGPU had full control over each and every decision to allow foreigners into the country, that allowed their inner sort of attitude towards foreigners to be expressed in each case. And they basically were not comfortable with foreigners coming in. The OGPU basically the OGPU kind of made the NKVD look liberal. They would deny every NKVD case where an NKVD had approved a case of immigration. So there's not really a big opening of the Soviet Union to the world in the 1920s. In fact, only about 3% of all applicants to immigrate into the Soviet Union during the 1920s were allowed in. Conversely, if you look at immigration and denaturalization policy, there's a great event which I call the Great Denaturalization of 1922-23, where 1.5 million former subjects of the Russian Empire had their citizenship declared null and void, basically. And it took the form of a series of deadlines by which all of the refugees, emigres, anyone who had left the Soviet Union, the space of the former Russian Empire, they were given a deadline by which they had to appear before a Soviet consulate or representative abroad and formally naturalize as a Soviet citizen or accept Soviet citizenship. If they didn't do so by that deadline, they were declared to be stateless by the Soviet Union. The result of that was a huge stateless population that led to the Nansen Passport to deal with their situation and the like, because other countries were not willing to accept them at the time. This is important for many reasons. It's one of the first great denaturalizations of the 20th century. It also was an important point in the history of Russians in the world because 15 times more than ethnic Russians in this great denaturalization, in this great emigration during the Civil War and following the Civil War, 15 times more left than in all of Russian history prior to 1914. And the Soviet response was to denaturalize and sever their ties with the homeland forever. That is that's quite a dramatic turn of events, and a really important one in Russian history too. I mean, most countries, the story of citizenship in most countries involves intensive interaction between diasporas who have left and those who stay. And one distinctive thing about the 20th century Russian case is that there's very little allowed contact between those groups. Very little return migration is allowed or tolerated. Almost none in the Soviet era, but even prior to the Soviet era, in the imperial era, there was very little return migration, and that's something that in citizenship studies people have paid a lot of attention to. Say, for example, in the case of Italy, it was a huge phenomenon. People would not just make a one-time decision to go to the United States or wherever they were going, but they would often come back, and they would some of them came back permanently. Others made several trips, and the mutual influences between those communities and their homelands were enormously important, and scholars have really begun to dig into that. It's really distinctive that Russia didn't have any of that tradition, really. I mean, very little of it. So I end the basic story of the book in the 1930s, when Stalin seals the borders and ends engagement with the outside world. Emigration is almost completely banned, and immigration becomes extremely difficult. The attract and hold theme of the earlier parts of the book is reduced to basically just hold. And the absolute number of foreigners on Soviet territory falls dramatically to less than 1/10 of the level of the late imperial period. And the number of legal border crossings, one measure of the intensivity of the citizenship boundary with the outside world, the number of legal border crossings falls to about 1% of 1909 levels, just to give a sense for the dramatic scale of the turn. So that's the basic historical core of the study. Just a few of the many things in those chapters. The book concludes with an epilogue on the re-emergence of pre-1914 citizenship dilemmas in the decades since the Soviet collapse. And the core dilemma is basically this distinction between the desire to draw in population, attract and hold population, versus the impulses of population policy to get the kind of people you want in your country. And this has been the basic dilemma of Russian citizenship policy since. We all know the story of the demographic issues of the Russian Federation, which saw a massive decline in growth of the population. And it was particularly important because of the working age, the impacts on the working age sort of chart, if you will. I mean, the number of working age young people fell dramatically, and they have to support a larger older population. That has reversed. I mean, the population decline has slowed or even stopped and slightly reversed recently, but it's still a huge problem. Most of the economic analyses of the structure of the Russian population indicate that Russia is going to need to find workers somehow, somewhere, if it's going to continue high growth rates. And where do you find workers? Through an open immigration policy. The problem, of course, the great dilemma, is that Putin's coalition and Russian politics are very much linked to strong anti-immigrant groups and nativist national sentiment, which is very powerful in Russia. And it's not just Putin using this instrumentally, it's a force that he doesn't always control. And it's a force it's an argument and a force that also sometimes appears even among opposition. Alexei Navalny being the most famous case, who got an early start through some of his own nativist sentiments. So this idea of Russia for the Russians and sort of a populist nativism is at the source of this key dilemma that Russia faces. It's going to need millions of new workers, and it's going to have to figure out how to come to some sort of solution with this. Now, the pre-1914 historical tradition might provide some palatable and not so palatable solutions, but looking back to it, I think could be something that would be worthwhile for contemporaries in the Russian situation today. So it's a real problem in the sense too that one of the results of the last 20 years has been that there's been a very, very small number of naturalizations of anyone except people from within the former Soviet space. There were about 7.5 million naturalizations in the 1990s. It was a strong decade of openness to this to naturalization. But in 2002, a new law made it very difficult, even for people from the former Soviet states, to naturalize in the Russian Federation. And the number of 99% of all the naturalizations in the last 20 years have been from former Soviet states. Attracting from beyond that sphere has proven to be extremely difficult. And the responses have been not, frankly, very serious. Banning foreign adoptions, attracting the occasional disaffected actor trying to evade taxes, really aren't going to solve this long-term dilemma. So I'll just leave it at that. Russia faces a dilemma, and maybe history can help.